Doris's son, Bob, was sent on a secret military mission, and she fully believed that he would return home safely. But when two soldiers knocked on her door with a goodbye letter from Bob, Doris's world was turned upside down. She couldn't believe what she was reading and knew that she had to check for herself if the contents of the letter were true. So, with the help of her siblings, Doris dug up her son's grave in the dead of night, hoping to find the answers she needed. But what she found when she opened the coffin was something that she could never have imagined. This shocking true story will leave you speechless and will have you on the edge of your seat until the very end. Doris and her team had been searching for the truth for months, and they were finally closing in on the answer. They had been digging through the cemetery at midnight, using their flashlights to guide their way through the darkness. They had been working for hours, and Doris was starting to feel the fatigue weighing on her. But she knew that they were almost there, and she was determined to see their mission through to the end. She could feel the excitement building inside her as they dug deeper and deeper, and she knew that the truth was just within their reach. Despite the cold and the darkness, Doris was determined to keep going, and she urged her team to keep digging. "We're almost there," she said, her voice filled with determination. "We just have to keep going a little bit longer." After what seemed like an eternity, Doris and her team finally heard the sound they had been waiting for. The sound of their shovels hitting wood. They knew that this meant they had reached the coffin of Bob, the man they had been searching for. They stopped digging and looked at each other, their eyes filled with hope and excitement. They had been working for hours, and they knew that they were finally close to finding the answers they had been seeking. As they carefully removed the dirt and debris that covered the coffin, they could feel their hearts racing with anticipation. They knew that whatever they found inside could change everything, and they could only pray that they would find the answers they needed. They worked quickly and carefully, trying not to disturb the coffin or its contents. And finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they were able to lift the lid and reveal the truth that lay inside. As he watched his coffin being carried out of the cemetery, he couldn't believe what was happening. He felt a mixture of horror and excitement coursing through his veins, and he couldn't tear his eyes away from the scene unfolding before him. He knew that this was it, the moment of truth, and he couldn't wait to see what was inside. As the coffin was lifted and the lid was opened, Doris peered inside with a mixture of curiosity and fear. She had always had her doubts about what they would find, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But as she looked inside, she couldn't believe her eyes. "I knew it," she whispered, a triumphant look on her face. But what did Doris see when the coffin was opened? Bob had always known that he was destined to join the army. From a young age, he had dreamed of serving his country and being a role model for younger children. He was driven and determined, and he was more than ready to take on the challenges that the military would bring. Doris, Bob's mother, was not thrilled about the idea of her son going off to fight in foreign wars. She was worried about his safety and the dangers he would face, and she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that filled her every time she thought about it. But she knew that there was nothing she could do to stop him. Bob was a grown man, and she had to respect his decision. She just hoped that he would come home safe and sound. Despite her reservations, Doris initially held out hope that her son would eventually give up on his dream of joining the army. But as time went on, it became clear that Bob was more determined than ever to pursue a military career. He spent every spare moment studying and preparing for life in the army. Daily he was watching movies and documentaries about modern battlefields and tactical missions, and reading about the latest weapons and technology being developed. Doris could see the passion and drive in his eyes, and she knew that there was nothing she could say or do to change his mind. Bob was determined to join the army, and nothing was going to stand in his way. Bob was eager to begin his military career as soon as possible, and on the day he turned 18, he was up at the crack of dawn, ready to enroll in military school. He knew that it was going to be a tough journey, but he was more than ready to take on the challenge. He was determined to succeed and achieve his goal, no matter what it took. Doris found it difficult to come to terms with her son's decision, but she knew that there was nothing she could do to stop him. She watched with a mix of pride and sadness as Bob left for military school, knowing that he was embarking on a new chapter in his life. She could only hope that he would come home safe and sound, and that he would be able to achieve all that he had dreamed of. It didn't take long for Bob to stand out at military school. He was already in excellent physical shape when he arrived, which helped him excel in all of his classes and training sessions. His natural talent and determination were clear to see, and it wasn't long before he caught the attention of his instructors. As the weeks and months passed, Bob continued to thrive. He was consistently at the top of his class, and he worked tirelessly to achieve his goals. And then, something truly extraordinary happened. Bob became one of only a handful of people in the history of the military school to graduate early. It was an impressive feat, and one that was a testament to his hard work and dedication. Doris was proud of her son, and she knew that he was destined for great things in the military. Despite her initial reservations, Doris had come to be proud of her son's military career. She knew that he had worked hard to get where he was, and she was grateful that his promotions had reduced the likelihood of him being sent to fight on the front lines. Everything seemed to be going well, and Bob's hard work paid off when he was promoted to corporal. However, as soon as Bob was promoted, he was deployed to the front lines. Doris couldn't help but worry about her son's safety, and she hoped that he would come home soon. She knew that being a corporal meant that he would be taking on more responsibilities and facing more dangers, and she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that filled her every time she thought about it. But she also knew that Bob was strong and capable, and she had faith that he would come home safely. As he prepared to leave for the front lines, Bob had to complete a number of required procedures, including writing a farewell letter. This was standard protocol for soldiers being deployed on dangerous missions, and it was meant to provide some sense of closure in the event that something tragic happened. Some soldiers treated the process lightly, but Bob was very serious about his letter. He kept it a closely guarded secret, refusing to allow even his closest army friends to read it. It was clear to everyone that Bob took the letter very seriously, and many of his friends wondered what he had written. Some speculated that it contained heartfelt goodbyes and words of wisdom, while others thought that it might be a more practical document, outlining his final wishes and instructions. Whatever was contained within the letter, it was clear that it was deeply personal and meaningful to Bob, and he wanted to keep it that way. Bob had a feeling that something was off about this mission. He had been selected for the program in a way that was new to him, and he had no control over the selection process. This resulted in him being placed on a team with a group of guys who were relatively unknown to him, which gave him a strange feeling. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was not quite right, and he couldn't help but wonder what was really going on. Despite his reservations, Bob knew that he had to put his doubts aside and focus on the mission at hand. He was a professional, and he was determined to do his duty to the best of his abilities. But as he prepared to head out into the field, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, and he couldn't help but wonder what was waiting for him out there. Bob was a member of the military, and as part of his job, he was required to follow orders without question. He was given a mission to undertake, but the details were kept secret, even from his own family. This meant that his mother had no idea when he would be returning home, and the uncertainty of the situation was causing her a lot of stress and worry. The days that followed were difficult for both Bob and his mother, as they struggled with the uncertainty of the situation and the emotional toll it was taking on them. Despite the challenges they were facing, Bob remained committed to his mission, knowing that it was an important part of his duty as a member of the organization. Bob and his team were not given any information about their destination before they left on their mission. This was done to maintain the highest level of secrecy and to prevent any potential espionage efforts from discovering their location. Bob and his team were blindfolded before they boarded the plane, further adding to the mystery and uncertainty of the situation. As a young corporal, Bob had never encountered such extreme measures before, and he couldn't help but wonder if there were spies operating at high levels within the organization, causing these extra precautions to be put in place. Despite his concerns, Bob remained focused on the mission at hand and trusted that his superiors had good reasons for the secrecy. He and his team boarded the plane, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. During the days following their departure, Bob and his team were exposed to a number of shocking and distressing experiences. They saw things that were so horrifying and unbelievable that they struggled to process what they were seeing. Bob was not sure where he had been deployed, but he knew that this was nothing like the movies or documentaries he had seen about war or conflict. He and his team were confronted with situations and experiences that were beyond their comprehension, and they were forced to confront their own mortality in a way they had never done before. The horrors they saw left a deep and lasting impact on them, and they knew that they would never be the same after witnessing such atrocities. As the days went on, Bob found himself increasingly questioning his decision to undertake this mission. He began to regret ever leaving home and putting himself in this terrible situation. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a grave mistake, and he found himself consumed by doubts about his professional career and his future. Bob couldn't help but wonder what he was about to see in this unknown territory, and if he would ever be able to hug his beloved mother again. He had always been a dutiful and obedient soldier, but now he found himself wondering if there were other paths he could have taken. Despite his doubts and fears, Bob knew that he had to keep going, even if it meant facing unimaginable horrors. The next day, Bob and his team were driving towards their base camp, looking forward to a well-deserved rest after completing their objective. They had been working non-stop for days, and they were exhausted and drained. As they drove, they heard a loud crash and felt the car come to an abrupt stop. Dust and debris flew up around them, clouding their vision and making it difficult to see what was happening. It was only when they heard the sound of gunfire and shouting that they realized they were being ambushed. Bob and his team were caught completely off guard and had no time to prepare for the attack. They were trapped in the car, vulnerable and exposed, as the enemy closed in on them from all sides. They knew that they had to act fast if they were going to survive this sudden and unexpected assault. Bob was suddenly overcome by a sharp pain in his back, and everything went black. He was dimly aware of his team yelling and shouting around him, and he knew that they needed help. He tried to get up and join them, but he was in too much pain and could barely move. He could feel his strength and energy slipping away, and he knew that he was losing consciousness. As the darkness closed in around him, Bob realized that this might be the last moment of his life. He thought about his mother and all the things he wished he could have said to her, and he knew that he would never get the chance to tell her how much he loved her. With a final surge of effort, Bob tried to hold on, hoping against hope that he would make it through this terrible ordeal. But it was no use, and as the darkness consumed him, he knew that he was about to succumb to his injuries. A couple of days later, the doorbell rang at Bob's house. When Doris, Bob's mother, answered the door, she saw two military officers standing on the front porch. Their expressions were grave and serious, and Doris immediately knew what their visit meant. The weight of the news hung heavy in the air. She had dreamed and dreaded this moment for a long time, knowing that a visit from military officers usually meant that a son or daughter serving in the army had been killed. Doris's heart sank as she realized that her young son Bob was gone forever. The somber words uttered by the officers filled the room, leaving behind a painful void. Bob's absence enveloped the house in a solemn silence, broken only by Doris's soft sobbing. As Doris opened the door, the two military officers greeted her with sympathetic looks. They knew how difficult this news would be for her to hear, and they gave her a moment to process it. Doris invited them into her mother's house, and the two men followed her inside. One of the officers took out a letter and handed it to Doris. She looked at it for a moment, but then told the officers that she couldn't bear to read it right now. She placed the letter in the drawer of her nightstand and asked the officers if they could leave her alone for a while to grieve. The officers understood and respectfully left the house, leaving Doris alone to come to terms with the devastating news that her son Bob had been killed. 3 days after Bob's death, the military held a funeral for the missing men. The funeral had been scheduled to take place 2 days after the event occurred, but it had been postponed for some reason. Doris found this strange, and she tried to contact the military to ask why the funeral had been postponed. However, she was unable to get through to anyone, and she had to wait for the military to call her back with an explanation. In the meantime, she was left to wonder what had caused the delay, and she hoped that the military would provide her with some answers soon. And answers are coming for Doris. As the days passed, Doris's suspicions grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was not right about the postponing of the funeral and the lack of communication from the military. Eventually, Doris decided that she had to read her son's goodbye letter. She knew that it would be difficult to read, but she felt like she needed to know what Bob had wanted to say to her before he died. So, that night, she went upstairs to her bedroom and closed the door behind her. She retrieved the letter from the drawer of her nightstand and looked at it for a moment, wondering if it was really a good idea to read it. The thought of hearing her son's last words was both comforting and painful, but Doris knew that she had to know what he had wanted to say to her. She took a deep breath and opened the letter, hoping that it would provide her with some closure and help her to come to terms with her son's death. Doris was shocked and saddened as she read the final words written by her son. She had been expecting a heartfelt message, or perhaps some final words of wisdom, but instead, the letter contained something that she could hardly believe. Despite her initial disbelief, Doris knew that the letter was genuine and decided to keep it hidden, tucking it away under her pillow where no one else would be able to find it. She knew that the contents of the letter were meant for her eyes only, and she was determined to keep it that way. As she lay in bed, tears streaming down her face, Doris couldn't help but wonder what could have driven her son to write such a disturbing and unexpected message. After reading her son's letter, Doris was devastated and completely lost faith in the military. She had always believed in the integrity and honor of the National Defense Force, but the contents of the letter had shattered that belief and left her feeling betrayed and disillusioned. Despite her grief and shock, Doris attended her son's funeral with her head held high, determined to show respect for the life he had lived and the sacrifices he had made. However, she couldn't shake the feeling of disbelief and disgust at the revelations contained in the letter, and she struggled to come to terms with the fact that such terrible things were happening within the military organization she had once held in such high regard. As Doris looked into the eyes of the two soldiers who had delivered her son's letter to her, she couldn't help but notice that they seemed unusually nervous. They fidgeted and avoided her gaze, as if they were hiding something or were worried about being caught. Doris wondered if they had read the letter and were now feeling guilty or ashamed of its contents. She also couldn't help but consider the possibility that the envelope had been tampered with, and the letter had been read before it reached her. Despite the seal on the envelope, it was possible that someone had switched it out for a different one in an attempt to uncover the letter's secrets. Doris felt a surge of mistrust and suspicion towards the soldiers, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was not quite right. After the funeral was over and the guests had begun to disperse, Doris noticed that the two military officers who had been watching the edge during the service made no effort to approach her or offer their condolences. This struck Doris as odd, as she had expected them to at least offer their condolences or express their sympathy. Instead, they seemed to avoid her and remained on the periphery of the gathering. When the funeral was over, almost all the guests who had been present said goodbye to Doris. However, the woman noted that the two military officers who had been watching the edge did not make any contact with her. She wondered why this was, and if this had something to do with the fact that they might be hiding something. Despite the outpouring of support from friends and loved ones at her son's funeral, Doris went home feeling overwhelmed and emotionally drained. The pain of losing her son was almost too much to bear, and she felt isolated and alone as she tried to come to terms with her grief. She knew that she needed to do something to honor her son's memory and to seek justice for the disturbing revelations contained in his letter. But she also knew that she couldn't do it alone. She felt helpless and unsure of what steps to take, but she was determined to find a way to make a difference and to honor her son's sacrifice. Despite the fact that Doris wasn't always the most attentive or supportive sister, she knew that she needed the help and support of her siblings now more than ever. She was determined to honor her son's memory and to seek justice for the disturbing revelations contained in his letter, and she knew that she couldn't do it alone. She called each of her siblings and asked them to meet with her the following afternoon, but she didn't give them many details over the phone, fearing that military equipment might be listening in on her conversations. She was anxious and uncertain about what the future would hold, but she was determined to do whatever it took to honor her son and to stand up for what was right. The following day, Doris met with her two brothers and sister at her older brother's house, and she began to tell them everything about her son's final letter. As she spoke, her brothers were shocked and saddened by the revelations contained in the letter, and they asked to read it for themselves. Doris's sister, however, had a feeling that something was wrong and had brought the letter with her, knowing that Doris might need it. As they read the letter together, the siblings were united in their determination to honor their brother's memory and to seek justice for the disturbing revelations contained within. They knew that they couldn't let this injustice stand, and that they had to do whatever it took to expose the truth and hold those responsible accountable. Doris gave her siblings half an hour to read, analyze, and process the letter. They read it at least 5 times, trying to understand the motivations behind her son's words and to determine the truth of the allegations contained within. Despite their efforts, they were still skeptical and couldn't understand why Bob would write such a damning letter in his final moments. They knew that there was only one way to find out if the letter was genuine and if they were really going to pursue justice in their brother's name. They would have to investigate further and gather more evidence to support their claims. The 3 of them were united in their determination to honor their brother's memory and to expose the truth, no matter what the cost. Finally, Doris brought up the idea that had been looming in the back of all of their minds. They would have to exhume her son's coffin in order to find out the truth. She was afraid to suggest it, as she knew that it was a drastic and potentially controversial move, but she felt that it was the only way to get to the bottom of the mystery and honor her son's memory. At first, her siblings were horrified by the idea, as it seemed like a grotesque and disrespectful thing to do. However, they knew that it was the only way to confirm the veracity of the letter and to gather more evidence in their quest for justice. They agreed to go ahead with the plan, but they knew that they would have to be very careful and discreet in order to avoid attracting unwanted attention or causing a scandal. Digging up a grave is illegal, even if it is done by the deceased person's own relatives, as it is considered a disturbing of the peace and a disrespect to the memory of the deceased. This is especially true if the grave is a military grave, as the consequences could be severe and result in heavy penalties. Knowing this, Doris and her siblings knew that they would have to be very careful and discreet in their actions. They decided to only dig at night when there was less likelihood of being seen or caught, and they planned to make it a one-night job in order to minimize the chances of getting caught. They knew that if the grave was not returned to its original state by morning, They would be at risk of being discovered and facing the consequences of their actions. However, they were determined to uncover the truth and honor their brother's memory, and they were willing to take the risk in order to do so. For the rest of the day, Doris and her siblings worked to prepare for their risky mission. They gathered all of the tools and equipment they would need, including shovels, pickaxes, and lanterns, and they made a detailed schedule to ensure that they could work as efficiently and discreetly as possible. As the night of the exhumation approached, Doris's heart was pounding with fear and anxiety. She was terrified that someone would see them and report them to the authorities, leading to severe consequences. However, her brothers reassured her and did their best to calm her nerves, knowing that they needed to stay focused and determined in order to succeed. Despite the risks and uncertainties, they were all united in their determination to uncover the truth and honor their brother's memory. This mission was very out of character for Doris, who was usually a calm and level-headed person. She found the whole experience to be emotionally and physically draining, and she had to take several breaks throughout the night in order to compose herself. As they worked to dig up her son's grave, Doris couldn't help but feel conflicted and uncertain about whether or not they were making a mistake. She cried a few times as she grappled with the weight of her grief and the gravity of what they were doing. The whole night seemed to be a roller coaster of emotions, with Doris feeling a mix of sadness, anger, and determination as she worked to uncover the truth and honor her son's memory. However, as they dug deeper into the grave, Doris's doubts began to dissipate, and she started to feel more confident in their mission. She knew that they were doing the right thing, and that the truth needed to be uncovered in order to honor her son's memory and seek justice. She looked contentedly at her two burrowing brothers, feeling grateful for their support and determination. That is all, she thought to herself. The truth will finally come out, no matter what it takes. Despite the risks and challenges they faced, Doris was determined to see their mission through to the end, knowing that it was the only way to honor her son's memory and to find peace in the aftermath of his untimely death. After 4 grueling hours of digging, Doris and her siblings finally heard the sound of their shovels hitting something solid. They knew that they had reached Bob's coffin, and Doris could see the lacquered wood of her son's coffin reflecting the light of the full moon. She felt a surge of emotion as she realized that they were about to discover the truth about her son's final moments. She couldn't help but wonder if they would find the answers they were looking for in the coffin, or if they would be left with even more questions and uncertainty. Despite her fears and doubts, Doris was determined to see the mission through to the end, knowing that it was the only way to honor her son's memory and to find peace in the aftermath of his untimely death. As Doris and her siblings worked to open the coffin, one of her brothers cleaned all the dirt off the lid, while she and the other brother scraped the last bits of sand around the edges of the coffin. They pried it open with a crowbar, and a loud bang followed as the lid came loose. The creaking of the wood was louder than they had expected, and Doris looked around nervously, worried that they would be caught and face the consequences of their actions. Despite her fears, she knew that they had to keep going in order to honor her son's memory and to uncover the truth. She took a deep breath and steeled herself for whatever lay ahead. Fortunately, Doris and her siblings were able to open the coffin without being caught, as no one was close enough to hear the loud noises they made. They watched with a mixture of horror and excitement as the wooden lid was removed, revealing the body of Doris's son inside. Despite her initial resolve, Doris couldn't help but feel a sense of doubt and uncertainty about what they were doing. She wondered if it was really the right thing to do, and she questioned whether they should continue. However, her brothers were already fully convinced that they were on the right track and that they should keep going in order to honor their brother's memory and uncover the truth. Doris knew that she couldn't let her doubts and fears hold her back, and she resolved to see the mission through to the end, no matter what the cost. When the lid of the coffin was finally lifted, Doris couldn't believe what she saw. "I knew it," she said, her voice surprisingly calm despite the overwhelming emotions she was feeling. However, as she spoke those words, a tear rolled down her cheek, betraying the depth of her grief and sadness. Both of her brothers stood there, frozen, as they stared in disbelief at the contents of the coffin. They couldn't believe what they were seeing, and they were filled with a sense of shock and confusion. How was this possible? They closed the lid again, knowing that they had to bury their brother a second time in order to protect his memory and to preserve the dignity of his final resting place. Despite the heartache and sorrow they felt, Doris and her siblings knew that they had to stay strong and united in their quest for justice. As the night began to wane and the sun started to rise over the horizon, Doris and her siblings knew that they had to finish their mission and get away from the cemetery as quickly as possible. They worked frantically to rebury their brother and to return the grave to its original state, making sure to leave no trace of their presence behind. When they were finally finished, they grabbed their tools and scampered. The group sprinted towards the car that was parked at the end of a cul-de-sac. As they jumped over the fence and ran towards the vehicle, they could see a dark and suspicious car heading towards the cemetery, and they knew that they had to get away before they were caught. They climbed into the car and drove off as quickly as they could, hoping to escape unnoticed and unscathed. After their mission was complete, Doris's brothers drove her home and said goodbye before heading back to their own homes. Doris was deeply grateful for their support and for the risks they had taken in order to help her uncover the truth about her son. As she closed the front door of her house, she hurried to her office, determined to write down her findings and to share them with the world. She knew that she was taking a huge risk in exposing the truth, and she was afraid that something might happen to her as a result. However, she was determined to make sure that the world at least knew the truth about her son's death and the disturbing revelations contained in his final letter. She sat down at her desk and began to type, hoping that her words would make a difference and help to bring justice for her son and all of those who had suffered at the hands of corruption and injustice. After writing down all of her findings and the details of her son's final letter, Doris knew that she had to do something drastic in order to make sure that the truth was exposed and that justice was served. She decided to print a copy of the newspaper with the whole story and to email it to a large newspaper company nearby, hoping that they would pick up the story and run it in their next edition. This was her way of letting the military know that she was not going to let them get away with what they had done to her son and that she was determined to see justice served. She knew that this was a risky move and that it could have serious consequences for her and her family, but she was willing to take the risk in order to honor her son's memory and to expose the truth. 2 days after Doris sent her story to the newspaper company, it was printed and spread throughout the city. Doris was both pleased and afraid of what would happen next, as she knew that exposing the truth would likely have serious consequences. As she waited for the fallout from her actions, she tried to prepare herself for whatever might come next. Before she knew it, the military showed up at her door the same day, apparently wanting to welcome her and thank her for her bravery. Doris complied with their request, but not without having something up her sleeve. She knew that she had to be careful and stay one step ahead in order to protect herself and her family, and she was determined to use every tool at her disposal to ensure that justice was served. 2 officers that Doris had never seen before took her to a military interrogation room, where they began to question her about the history that was happening in the city. Doris knew that she had to be careful in how she answered their questions, as she didn't want to reveal too much or put herself in danger. She had sent the letter anonymously, so no one was officially sure that it was Doris who had tipped off the paper about the disturbing revelations contained in her son's final letter. She tried to stay calm and composed as the officers grilled her, knowing that the more information she gave them, the more at risk she would be. She hoped that she could get through the interrogation without revealing too much and without putting herself in danger. Therefore, Doris denied having any knowledge of the letter or the information contained within it, saying that she had no idea what the officers were talking about. However, after about 15 minutes of questioning, Doris decided that it was time to make her move. She knew that she couldn't keep denying the truth forever, and she hoped that by showing the officers the letter, she could prove to them that she was telling the truth. She reached into her inside pocket and retrieved the letter that Bob had written to her, placing it on the table in front of the officers. The officers looked at each other in confusion, not sure what to make of this development. "Read it," Doris told them, hoping that the contents of the letter would convince them of her honesty and of the gravity of the situation. The officers read the letter several times, and after a while, they were too stunned to speak. "Ma'am, one of the officers began, but Doris cut him off, determined to make her point. "He will do everything in his power to bring my son back to the United States," she said firmly, hoping that the officers would understand the gravity of the situation and the importance of her request. None of the officers had ever been in a similar situation before, and they sat in silence, not sure how to respond. They knew that they had to take Doris's request seriously and do everything in their power to honor her son's memory and to bring justice to those who had been responsible for his untimely death. After the questioning was over, Doris was sent home without much information or clarification about what would happen next. As she had already suspected, all she could do now was wait. She waited anxiously for the police to show up and arrest her for digging up her son's grave. She waited for the military to show up with her son's real body. And she waited for any sign or indication that her son was still alive. She knew that these were all long shots, but she couldn't shake the hope that she might somehow be able to bring her son back, or to get justice for his untimely death. She knew that it was a long and difficult road ahead, but she was determined to stay strong and to do whatever it took to uncover the truth and bring justice for her son. As the days of waiting turned into weeks, Doris began to lose hope that she would ever see her son alive again. It seemed like an impossible dream, and she knew that the chances of it coming true were slim. However, one day, she suddenly received a letter from the military. She was told that they had located her son, but they were not sure if he was alive or not. Doris's heart raced with hope and fear as she read the letter, not sure what to believe or what to expect. She knew that she had to stay strong and keep the faith, no matter what the outcome might be. She hoped and prayed that her son was still alive and that she would somehow be able to bring him home. Doris's entire body trembled with excitement and relief when she received the letter from the military. She was not necessarily hopeful that she would see her son alive again, but she was grateful to finally have some answers and to know that the military was working to locate him. Over the next few days, Doris found herself constantly looking out the windows, waiting and hoping for some sign of what was to come. The anticipation was almost too much to bear when a black family car pulled up in front of her house, and Doris wondered if this could be the moment she had been waiting for. She held her breath as she watched the car approach, wondering if her son was finally coming home. To Doris's complete surprise, as she watched the black car pull up to her house, she saw her son Bob get out of the car and start walking towards her front door. Her heart raced with excitement and happiness as she called out his name, and she hurried to the door to greet him. When Bob finally walked through the door, Doris threw herself at him, hugging him tight and sobbing with joy and relief. However, Bob gently pushed her away, and Doris could see that he was smiling despite the tears that were streaming down his face. "Ouch," she said with a laugh, feeling overwhelmed and grateful to finally have her son back home safe and sound. After they had hugged and cried and caught up for a few minutes, Doris and Bob sat down on the sofa together, and Bob began to tell her everything that had happened to him. He told her every detail of his experience, from the moment he was sent to the front lines to the day he was captured, and the moment he set foot in his homeland again. Doris listened with a mixture of horror and amazement as Bob told her about the torture and abuse he had suffered at the hands of his captors. He had been beaten and burned, but he had never given up hope and had always trusted that his mother would continue the search for him until she found him, dead or alive. Doris couldn't believe the strength and determination that her son had shown in the face of such adversity, and she was filled with pride and love for him. If you want to continue enjoying inspiring stories like this one, subscribe to our channel or check out the other videos shown at the bottom of the screen. Thank you for your cooperation.